They say the greatest discoveries are accidents.
What's happening?
But in the refrigerated silence of the kilometers-deep Hadron facility, what Dr. Ben Carter's team discovered was not an accident. It was an inevitability. They hadn't intended to punch a hole in reality. They were merely testing the limits of particle collision. But reality, it seemed, had a brittle edge. It was not a vortex. It was not a gateway. It was, as the instruments confirmed, a perfect 2-centimeter absence. A void. The aperture, it did not radiate energy. It did not emit sound. It did not pull matter in. It simply existed, floating precisely 1.4 meters above the containment floor, darker than physics allowed. And from the moment it appeared, everyone in the complex felt it. A shift in the air, the cold certainty of an eye opening in a place where eyes should not be. A vast, impersonal, and impossibly ancient intelligence had turned its gaze upon them. It was not angry. It was not curious. It was attentive, and it had begun to take notes. It was born at 4:17 a.m., in the sterile hum of a facility buried deep enough to be immune to the world's weather. The event itself was anticlimactic. There was no explosion, no seismic shock. The super collider had reached its target energy, held it for a fraction of a second, and then, as the system cycled down, a single alarm chimed. It wasn't a critical failure alarm. It was an unexpected variable ping. In the control room, Dr. Ben Carter leaned forward, his reflection pale in the monitor. He pushed his glasses up, staring at the data. A stable energy vacuum? Perfect zero-point signature where there should have been a chaotic cascade of decaying exotic particles. "Shut down the beam," Ben said, his voice calm, though his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. "Isolate the chamber. Full diagnostics. What am I looking at, people?" A junior physicist, her face washed out by the blue light of her console, tapped at her keyboard. "Sensors are stable, Dr. Carter, but there's a visual distortion. Bringing it up on the main screen, the feed switched from numerical data to the high-definition camera inside the target chamber. And there it was. It floated in the precise geometric center of the reinforced sphere. It was not black, for black implies the absence of light. This was an absence of space. It was a 2-centimeter tear, a perfect circle of nothing that seemed to drink the harsh floodlights of the chamber, leaving no reflection. It was a hole in the world. Ben Carter was a man of logic. He lived by the elegant, unwavering laws of the universe. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, they were his gospel. What he saw on that screen did not compute, yet he felt no fear, only a profound, suffocating rush of discovery. This was it. This was the moment that would redefine physics. He had stared into the heart of the atom and found a void staring back. "It's beautiful," he whispered. 50 meters away, outside the 3-meter-thick concrete and lead-lined bulkhead of the containment zone. Raj Sharma flinched. Raj was a man of different, simpler laws. An order given was an order followed. A threat was a thing you could see, target, and neutralize. His job was to walk a perimeter, check seals, and babysit a group of scientists who played with forces they barely understood. He was halfway through his patrol when the air changed. It wasn't a sound or a temperature drop. It was a feeling. The same feeling he'd had in the high deserts of Afghanistan, moments before an IED detonated. It was the feeling of being watched by something that did not wish him well. He stopped, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he no longer carried in this sterile environment. The fluorescent lights of the corridor hummed. Nothing was out of place. Yet the pressure on the back of his neck was immense. He looked toward the sealed steel door of the target chamber, a sudden, irrational coldness pooling in his stomach. He felt, for the first time in his life, nakedly visible. Back in the control room, the initial euphoria was settling into methodical procedure. Ben deployed the chamber's internal diagnostic drones, small, spider-like robots designed to repair circuits. "Send one in close," Ben ordered. "Laser telemetry. I want to know its precise dimensions, and if it has a measurable event horizon." They watched on the monitor as the small drone crept forward. It stopped 1 meter from the aperture. It extended a fine point laser. The red beam shot out, striking the edge of the void, and vanished. It did not reflect. It did not scatter. It simply ceased to be. "Intriguing," Ben murmured, scribbling in his notepad. "It's a perfect light sync. A micro-singularity? No, the gravitational readings are flat. It's just an aperture. It was then he felt it. Not the base, primal warning that Raj had felt, but a subtle intellectual friction. He was looking at the aperture on the screen, and he had the sudden, disorienting sensation that it was looking back, not at the camera. At him, he shook his head. A projection, anthropomorphizing a physics equation. He was tired, but the feeling lingered. It was a cold, dry attention, like being examined by a geologist who was classifying, not a predator who was hunting. It was the gaze of an intelligence so vast and alien that curiosity and malice were irrelevant, childish terms. It was simply observing. Raj, meanwhile, had arrived at his checkpoint outside the chamber entrance. The main feed from inside was displayed on a small monitor by the door. He saw the impossible black spot hanging in the air. His earlier unease solidified into a hard knot of dread. He was a tidy man. His uniform was pressed. His boots were shined. He believed in order. He believed in things being where they were supposed to be. And that thing on the screen was fundamentally, spiritually wrong. He watched Dr. Carter, visible on a small picture-in-picture feed from the control room, buzzing with excitement. But Raj's eyes were drawn back to the void. He felt the gaze again, stronger now, as if it had focused. It was not a look. It was an assessment. It was the feeling of a superior officer inspecting his barracks and finding a speck of dust on the windowsill. It was a look of profound, impersonal judgment. Raj Sharma, a decorated veteran, a man who had faced gunfire without flinching, was suddenly overwhelmed by an intense, bizarre urge. He wanted to check his posture. He wanted to smooth the front of his uniform. He felt incorrect. He felt messy. The aperture remained. For 48 hours, it hung suspended in the target chamber, an insult to every law of thermodynamics. It should have collapsed. The vacuum of the chamber should have equalized with the nothing it represented. But it did not. It was perfectly, stubbornly stable. Dr. Ben Carter, fueled by caffeine and a manic energy he hadn't felt since graduate school, worked tirelessly. He had run every non-invasive test possible. Magnetic fields were applied. They simply bent around the void as if it wasn't there. High-energy beams were fired. They entered and did not emerge. Sonic pulses were absorbed without echo. "It's a perfect data sync," he explained to a panel of increasingly nervous project overseers via video link. "It consumes information, reflects nothing. It is, by all measurements, a flaw in the fabric." But his scientific fascination was beginning to be eroded by a cold, creeping unease. The aperture was too perfect. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a manufactured object, a tool, a lens. The first true incident occurred at 0922 on the third day. It was subtle, so subtle that it was initially dismissed as a sensor glitch. In the control room, a digital clock on the main console, a clock synced directly to the facility's master atomic standard, flickered. It read 092214, then 092213, then 092214 again. It had, for one impossible second, ticked backward. "Comms glitch," muttered the junior physicist. But Ben saw it. He felt it. A momentary, dizzying sensation of déjà vu, as if the entire room had drawn a breath and exhaled the same moment. He looked at the feed from inside the chamber. The aperture was unchanged, but the air around it— Ben squinted. He couldn't be sure, but a mote of dust illuminated by the floodlights seemed to stop, hover, and then continue its path. "Run a check on all atomic clocks in the facility," Ben ordered, his voice sharp. The results came back 10 minutes later and they were chilling. Every clock in the complex was perfectly synced, except one. The hardened cesium-based clock inside the target chamber, placed there to measure relativistic effects, was now adrift. It was running slower than the rest of the facility by 0.7 picoseconds, microscopic, almost meaningless deviation. But it was impossible. "It's manipulating time," Ben whispered, a cold thrill running down his spine. "No, not time. It's manipulating the rate of time in its immediate vicinity." He needed more data. He ordered a high-precision gravimeter, a device sensitive enough to detect the gravitational pull of a passing truck, to be wheeled against the exterior of the containment chamber. At the same time, Raj Sharma was beginning to unravel. He had refused to take a break. He stood his post outside the sealed door, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the small monitor. He had stopped speaking to the scientists who passed. His world had shrunk to the distance between himself and that 2-centimeter circle. The feeling of being judged had become constant. It was a physical weight. He found himself meticulously cataloging his own failings. The time he'd cut a corner on a report, the harsh words he'd had with his sister on the phone. Every sloppy, inefficient human part of himself felt magnified, exposed under that cold, clinical gaze. It didn't hate him. He knew that. Hate was a passionate, messy emotion. This was different. This was the dispassionate scrutiny of an auditor who had found a deep, fundamental error in the ledger of existence. At 1440, as Ben Carter watched the new gravimeter readings, it happened again. This time it wasn't time. It was gravity. Raj, standing guard, suddenly felt his stomach lurch into his throat, as if he were in a rapidly ascending elevator. His feet, planted on the concrete floor, felt momentarily light, his boots seeming to lose purchase. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall. The sensation lasted only 3 seconds. In the control room, alarms shrieked. Ben Carter stared at the gravimeter readings, his knuckles white. "That's not possible," the junior physicist said, her voice trembling. That can't be. The gravitational constant, G, the bedrock of physics, the force that held the planets in their orbits and kept their feet on the floor. It was not a variable, it was a constant. But for 3 seconds inside the containment zone, it hadn't been. It had weakened. Not by much, less than 0.01%. But it had changed. And as they watched, the reading on the screen stabilized, returning to the exact, unwavering number it had always been. Ben Carter finally understood. He shut his eyes, the sterile light of the control room suddenly feeling hostile. The thing in the chamber wasn't a window. It was a hand reaching through. It wasn't just observing. It was not a passive intelligence. It was an engineer. It was tapping the walls of their reality, testing the structural integrity of their universe. It was learning the rules, and Ben was struck by a final, horrifying thought. It was learning the rules so it could decide which ones to break. By the 4th day, Raj Sharma had stopped blinking. He was still at his post outside the steel bulkhead. But the man who had been a model of military discipline was gone. His uniform collar was askew, sweat matting his hair to his forehead. The most terrible change, however, was his eyes. They were no longer focused on the monitor. They were staring through it, fixed on a point in space only he could perceive. The feeling of judgment was no longer a passive pressure. It had become a voice. Not a voice of words, but a continuous, cold, crystal-clear knowing that was being driven directly into his mind. It was showing him the disorder. It showed him the waste, the way the scientists walked the halls, the inefficient surplus movements, the way they gestured with their hands when they spoke, the way their breath randomly disturbed dust motes. Everything about the human condition was chaotic. The sloppy emotions, the unstructured thoughts, their asymmetrical, imperfect biology, untidy, disorganized, incorrect. "They don't understand," Raj began to mutter, his voice a dry, cracked thing. They can't see the filth." He began cleaning. It was small at first. He picked an imagined piece of lint off his sleeve. He adjusted a floor mat in the corridor until it was perfectly parallel with the grout lines. He then began disassembling his service pen, cleaning each piece and reassembling it. He did this again and again, a desperate ritual to impose order. Ben Carter, exhausted and rattled by the physics-defying fluctuations, finally left the control room to check on his security chief. He found Raj staring at the wall, his hands obsessively clicking the pen. "Raj, you need a relief. You've been on post too long," Ben said softly, keeping his distance. Raj's eyes swiveled from the wall and locked onto Ben. There was no recognition in them, only cold assessment. "Your tie," Raj whispered. Ben looked down, confused. "What, my tie?" "It's crooked," Raj said, a small tick starting at the corner of his mouth. "It's 1.2 degrees to the left. It's unacceptable. It doesn't like the asymmetry. It hurts to look at." "Raj, what are you talking about?" Who doesn't like? Ben asked, his scientific anxiety being rapidly replaced by a primal dread. Raj took a step toward Ben, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. The observer. It's watching us. All of us. And it doesn't like what it sees. We move wrong. He held up a trembling finger. It thinks we're messy. Too many moving parts. Too many inefficient decisions. Like a broken engine, a flawed equation, it's trying to figure out how to balance the ledger. Listen, you're having a breakdown. It's the stress, Ben began, but Raj cut him off, his voice cracking in a dry sob. No, don't you see? It's not angry. It's just disappointed. It's judging us. It's judging all of our sloppy, wet, random existence. Raj suddenly lunged for his security console and began hammering at the keypad. He was trying to shut down the corridor's ventilation system. Too much air movement, he muttered, typing furiously. Unnecessary, wasted energy has to be, still, tidy. Ben realized Raj wasn't just having a breakdown. He was being converted. He was the Aperture's first unwilling acolyte. Security, Ben yelled into his comms. I need medical support at Bulkhead 4. Immediately. When two other guards arrived, they found Raj slumped on the floor, holding his head, his body racked with tremors. He didn't fight as they lifted him. As they dragged him away, he turned his head, his eyes desperate, locking with Ben's. It's going to clean up, Doctor, he wept. It has to. It can't stand the mess. It's going to make us tidy. Ben Carter stood alone in the silent corridor, the echo of Raj's words hanging in the air. He looked at the steel door, and for the first time, he did not see a scientific marvel. He saw a tribunal, and the real horror settled upon him. Raj wasn't insane, he was just the first to understand the verdict. The replacement guard, a young, nervous private contractor, lasted precisely 4 hours before demanding a transfer, complaining of a migraine so severe he claimed he could feel his teeth vibrating. No one else would take the post. The corridor outside Bulkhead 4 became a dead zone. Ben Carter, now operating on pure, brittle adrenaline, sealed the control room. He was alone, the project overseers terrified by the reports of gravitational and temporal instability, and Ben's intentionally vague report on Sharma's medical leave had ordered a full facility shutdown pending a remote investigation. Ben refused. He had to know. He had to understand the judgment. He set up a new bank of monitors, his eyes scanning every piece of data. He was a scientist again, his fear momentarily packed away in favor of observation. The aperture remained unchanged. The atomic clock in the chamber was still drifting. The gravimeter still twitched periodically, as if the observer were idly plucking at the strings of reality. The first cleansing event was almost a relief. A lab mouse, used in a separate biology experiment 2 levels up, had escaped its cage and found its way into the ventilation system. Ben watched on a secondary monitor as it dropped from a duct into the sealed containment chamber, its tiny body unharmed by the fall, its scurried, sniffing the sterile floor. Ben watched fascinated. This was the first living, complex biological organism to be in the same room as the aperture. The mouse, seemingly oblivious to the void floating above it, ran in a frantic circle. It stopped, twitched its nose. Ben watched its heartbeat on a biosensor feed he'd patched in. The mouse's heart rate was erratic. It seemed confused. It ran directly towards the wall beneath the aperture. It passed into the 2-meter-wide zone that Raj had been so terrified of. The mouse did not scream. It did not explode or dissolve. It did not burn. It simply stopped being. One frame of the video feed, the mouse was there. A small, furry, chaotic smudge of life. The next frame, it was gone. Not gone as in moved quickly. Gone as in deleted. Ben scrubbed the footage back and forth. One frame, the next. There was no residue. No puff of displaced air. No scorch mark. It was an act of perfect clinical deletion. Ben felt his stomach clench. It's cleaning, he whispered, the echo of Raj's words chilling him to the bone. It's tidying up. He sat for an hour, his mind numb. He watched his own coffee cup on the console. It was half full. He had left a faint, greasy lip print on the ceramic rim. He thought of Raj, messy, untidy. He needed to test this. He needed to be sure. His hands trembling, He remotely uncalibrated a sensor inside the chamber. A small secondary temperature probe was programmed to deliberately feed false, erratic data into the system. It was an error. It was disorder. He watched the main screen. The probe, fixed to the wall, dutifully began spitting out nonsensical numbers. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Ben almost allowed himself to breathe. Then the sensor, its mounting bracket, and a half-meter circle of the concrete wall it was attached to vanished. It was the same event. One frame, they were there. The next, a perfect smooth circular hole remained, looking onto the raw, unfinished rock behind the chamber wall. The Aperture hadn't just removed the faulty sensor. It had removed the concept of the sensor, all the way down to its foundations. The message was clear. Errors will be corrected. The final event was an accident. The shutdown order had been given, but Dr. Eva Rosales, a geologist who had been checking seismic stability, hadn't gotten the memo. She was in a service tunnel 1 level down, and her comms were off. Ben saw her on a proximity sensor alert, moving towards the containment zone's service entrance, a door that led directly into the chamber itself. "Eva, get out of there!" Ben shouted into his comms, his voice cracking. "Eva, do not enter the chamber. Abort, abort." But she couldn't hear him. The heavy bulkhead door hissed open. Ben watched in abject horror as Eva stepped inside, carrying a data pad. She looked confused. "Ben, why is the chamber active?" she called out, looking up at the camera. "I thought the shutdown was..." She stopped. She must have seen it. The perfect black hole floating in the center of the room. She was a scientist. Her first reaction was not fear, but wonder. "My God, Ben," she whispered, taking a step toward it. "What is that?" "Eva, no, get back." "Don't move!" Ben screamed, pounding on his console, but she wasn't moving towards it. She was just there. She was an unquantified variable, an unexpected element. She was in the observer's cold calculus mess. Ben Carter watched the screen, his eyes wide, unable to look away. He saw Eva Rosales, his colleague for 6 years, the woman who had brought him coffee this morning. He watched her cease to exist. There was no sound, no light, just an instantaneous, perfect, and absolute absence. Her voice cut off mid-syllable. She was gone. The chamber was empty. The air was still. Ben sat back, the silence of the control room deafening. He looked at his own reflection in the dark monitor. He looked at his asymmetrical face. He looked at his trembling, inefficient human hands. He finally understood. The observer wasn't just judging, it was editing. For a long time, Ben Carter did not move. He sat in the glacial silence of the control room, the only sound his own suddenly too loud breathing. Eva was gone, deleted, a variable removed from an equation. The horror he felt was no longer the hot, adrenaline-fueled panic of a crisis. It was a cold, sinking, profound dread. It was the dread of understanding. He finally saw the truth, not as a human, but as the observer must see it. It was not an invasion. It was a correction. This observer, this intelligence, was not a conqueror. It was a custodian. It had stumbled upon their universe, a messy, chaotic, inefficient corner of existence, and it had reacted with the impersonal, automatic reflex of a gardener seeing a weed. You do not hate a weed. You do not fear it. You simply pull it. Eva wasn't murdered. She was filed. Raj wasn't driven insane. He was calibrated. And the experiment that had summoned this thing, the particle collision, that was the error. He was the error. Ben looked at his console. The data was still streaming. The gravitational constant was stable. The atomic clock in the chamber was... No, wait, he leaned closer. The clock was no longer drifting. It was now perfectly, impossibly in sync with the master clock outside. It wasn't just in sync. It was leading the master clock by a femtosecond. It was no longer observing or testing. It was now dictating. It was setting the new standard. A single red error light blinked on Ben's console. It was a sensor failure warning for a system 2 levels up. In the defunct biology lab, Ben watched the red light. Messy, untidy, an error. He watched, and as he watched, the red light on his physical console went out. It didn't just turn off. The LED itself, the small plastic bulb, vanished. It was gone. A tiny, perfect 2mm hole was left in the panel. Ben stopped breathing. The cleansing was no longer confined to the chamber. The zone was expanding. Or more accurately, the observer's influence was. It had learned the rules, and now it was applying its corrections remotely. He looked at his desk. A stack of papers, notes scrawled in his messy handwriting, a half-eaten protein bar, a dirty coffee mug. All of it was suddenly painfully offensive to him. All of it was a testament to his own chaotic, biological, flawed nature. He looked at the large red button on his console labeled Emergency Containment Flush. It was designed to fill the chamber with a rapidly expanding polymer foam, suffocating any reaction. A last resort. He reached for it, his hand trembling. This was the human response, wasn't it? To fight, to resist, to make a stand. He paused, his fingers hovering over the plastic cover. What would happen? A violent, chaotic explosion of chemicals. A desperate, messy attempt to fix an error with another, larger error. He could almost feel the observer's dispassionate focus intensify. He could feel its disappointment. It would be the act of a cornered, irrational animal, and it would be corrected. The foam would be deleted. The console would be deleted, and then he would be deleted. He slowly pulled his hand back. He thought of Raj weeping in the corridor. It's going to make us tidy. Ben Carter finally understood. There was no fighting this. You could not declare war on a fundamental principle of order any more than you could declare war on the concept of a straight line. You could only comply. Slowly, deliberately, Ben stood up. He looked at the half-eaten protein bar and its messy wrapper. With a calm, precise motion, he picked it up and dropped it into the waste bin. He took his dirty coffee mug and placed it perfectly in the center of his desk. He gathered his scattered, sloppy notes and stacked them into a single, neat pile. He straightened his chair so it was perfectly aligned with the console. He then looked at his own reflection in the dark monitor. He saw his uneven tie, the one that had so disturbed Raj. He reached up and straightened it, pulling the knot tight until it was perfectly centered. There was only one error left. The biggest one, the one who had opened the door. Ben Carter turned away from his clean, orderly console. He walked to the control room door, his footsteps steady and measured. He did not run. He did not panic. He walked down the empty, silent corridor, the same one where Raj had collapsed. He walked toward bulkhead 4. He was not a man going to his death. He was a scientist correcting his own experiment. He was a flawed equation, voluntarily submitting himself for erasure. It was the only logical, clean, and tidy solution. He reached the steel door. He looked at the small monitor, at the perfect 2-centimeter void hanging in the silence. It was waiting. With a final, steady breath, Ben Carter placed his hand on the keypad to open the door. If this story made you question the space around you, if you felt the chill of that 2-centimeter gaze, then please support our work. This channel runs on the curiosity of minds like yours. Subscribe, and consider supporting us directly. It allows us to continue searching the darkness for new stories to bring to light. Thank you for observing.